Hello?
I think this one's on. No? All right. Yeah, I'll talk to the agenda. So my name's Jeremy Millar. I am sort of the creator of the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. So what I think probably is most interesting for people here is to talk through how the EEA came to be, what it is trying to do, and where it's going, probably in that order. So I actually work on two projects in the space. One is EEA, and the other one is ConsenSys with a Y. So ConsenSys is building on the Ethereum blockchain and building many aspects of it. I started working with ConsenSys about last April, initially on trying to get BlockApps out of ConsenSys, in fact, as a standalone entity, which we did successfully. But what became very apparent when I was working with the BlockApps team and looking at the people building Ethereum platforms for the enterprise is this was Java circa 1996. So most people in this room are too young. Has anyone ever heard of a product called Kiva? NetDynamics? So Kiva and NetDynamics were two early Java application servers, Java web application servers, that were proprietary, right? They built extensions to Java APIs in order to build database-backed Java applications. And both of them, one was acquired by Sun and one was acquired by Netscape, I believe. Kiva was acquired by Netscape. One was acquired by Sun, one was acquired by Netscape, I believe. Point is, neither of them went anywhere. And what happened to all of the early proprietary Java middleware tools is they just all died. And it was with the advent of J2EE that there was a degree of standardization in the space that really drove mass adoption, right, in the form of WebLogic and Tomcat. And in fact, Sun was not involved in building J2EE, really, right? I mean, if anyone remembers the original Java demos, there was the coffee shop demo and the Java-enabled coffee pot and what have you. It was sort of a play on words. Java was initially designed to be an IoT operating system, right? It wasn't designed to be a web programming language. But what happened was, at the same time that large enterprises wanted to build websites, right, Java was there. And Java had two things that was really important. It had an HTTP API and it had a database API. So if you had a web server written in Java, you had a standard set of libraries for doing web programming and a standard set of libraries for doing database programming, right? And so when large companies started building websites, most of the first generational transactional systems, right, and many still today, were written in Java. Then ASP.NET came around and what have you, right? But without J2EE, it was very non-standardized. And so the creation of J2EE really allowed interoperability of the tools, application portability, and really spurned and was part of the broad adoption wave. And so at that point in time, I was on the Java team at Oracle building a lot of the underpinnings of what became J2EE. So when I saw Ethereum, right, my version of how did Ethereum become adopted in the enterprise goes like this. The Ethereum mainnet went live in June 2015, which is around the same time that the front page of the FT and the front cover of The Economist said the technology behind Bitcoin called blockchain will change finance. And as a result, banking CEOs called CIOs who called VPs of engineering and innovation and said, build me a blockchain. And they went around fishing for blockchain tools, and they found Ethereum. And they downloaded, Geth or whatever, the same code base that was running the public network, tweaked it 5 times, and built a blockchain, right? This is very, very similar to how Java got adopted in web programming, right? Very similar adoption pattern. Then what happened was a bunch of vendors started popping up, BlockApps, Nuco, Monax, what have you, that tried to productize the process of download Geth, make 10 changes to it, what have you, and make that more manageable and repeatable, right? But they were going through the same problems that the early Java web servers were doing, in which they were doing this in a proprietary way, right? Which meant no interoperability at the tools level, no interoperability at the management level, management tools level, which is even a bigger problem, risk of application portability, et cetera. So that's a bad path, right? Also, what had happened by the middle of last year is Hyperledger had turned into kind of a big deal. R3 was gaining traction. And in Ethereum, there was no enterprise counterweight, right? So the previously, wherever Alex is, Alex and I had talked about how do you create a hardened version of Ethereum to support financial smart contracts, which is a separate thing we've been talking about. So the EEA began at DevCon last September in Shanghai. Really, this is where the EEA really began. When Alex and I were in a talk in the back of the room, and I said, well, why don't we try and build Ethereum Enterprise Edition, right? To core Ethereum, what J2EE was to core Java, right? Why don't we go do that? And I sent Joe a text, and Joe and I and Alex, and Tyler Smith, some guys from Microsoft, Anoop from Cisco. Cisco only just joined the EEA, but Cisco was in the very, very, very first meeting of how to set up the EEA at DevCon in September last year. A few other people sat down with Vitalik. Vitalik was actually sitting down, working on some ZK Snark stuff at the time anyway, but we sat down with Vitalik and we said we want to do this. And in fact, previously, Vitalik, along with some of the other vendors in the space, had tried this once and been holding some conference calls on a monthly basis inside of the Ethereum Foundation that weren't really going anywhere. And the reason why they weren't going anywhere is they didn't have any of the big companies with them. So we showed up with all of the big companies and said, we should build this. So the EEA actually got started before Quorum was announced to the world. And so what we did when we got back is we basically started holding calls and calling everyone up that we knew were big names in Ethereum that were in large companies, and we started getting a group together to go and do this, right? And we talked to the Quorum team very early on in this process, and we got a hold of them, and and it became very clear that there was some real interest around standardizing how Ethereum is used at an infrastructure level in enterprises. So the first actual face-to-face meetings of what became the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance happened in the Microsoft offices in New York, December last year. We had a second set of similar meetings in January, where Vitalik attended. And we launched on February 28th. So one of the unique and compelling things around the creation of the EEA is it went from a first physical face-to-face meeting on December 15th to launch with signed legal agreements on February 28th. I don't think there's another consortium in blockchain that's done that. So the mission of the EEA was initially pretty simple to describe. And it can be described sort of in three ways. One is we shouldn't have everyone downloading the same set of open source libraries and changing them in similar but different ways each time. It's not useful to have vendors doing this in a proprietary way either, so we need to standardize that. Second issue is if you were to ask people what the top 3 issues are in using Ethereum in the enterprise environment, they are, with almost universal agreement, the ability to have an alternative to proof of work and, more importantly, pluggable consensus algorithms, data privacy within smart contracts, and some sort of permissioning model that resembles traditional roles-based access control in enterprise software, right? And those are the 3 top priorities, right? But what you don't want to do is have each vendor implement those capabilities differently. You want the APIs and interfaces to be standardized for doing that, right? In order to standardize the interfaces, you need a much, much more modular environment, right? So in order to achieve a vision of pluggable consensus, multiple implementations, standardizing the API, standardizing the interfaces, and allowing vendors to implement it however they want, you need to start with a more modular client, right? So one of the actual top priorities, not just for implementing NTETH, but also for Ethereum generally, is a more modular client. And a lot of that work is getting developed on Python, right? Which is why Piper Merriam, some of you may have seen, recently left ConsenSys to join the Ethereum Foundation, and we have thrown a couple of Python, and while some of his team has remained at ConsenSys to work on refactoring, a Python client, right? So one of the things you need to achieve something that looks like an NTETH is a more modular client. So what's happened since February and now, so we said we're going to launch this, we want to standardize how enterprises adopt Ethereum, here are the technical objectives, right? And what's happened now is the EEA has really divided and conquered, right? All along, the principle of the number one organization the EEA, at least in my mind, wanted to replicate is the IETF. How many people in here know what the IETF is? Okay, so the internet, all the standards that make the internet work are developed by an organization that has a grand total of 0 employees, right? Right? So that's not actually entirely true, but pretty much true, right? And the IETF has a couple of principles around how it runs. One is to achieve rough consensus. We don't care if everyone agrees or not, but we need to achieve rough consensus quickly. Get to code, entirely distributed organization, and effectively no rules. Now, unfortunately, that does not quite work for investment banks, right? So we had to do something. We had to create a slightly different governance model for the EEA than how the IETF is run. But one of the things that makes the IETF work and the internet work is the following. If I looked, when we were setting up the EEA, I went in and I looked, what was the last submission Google had made to the IETF? The last submission Google had made to the IETF as of last fall was a metadata extension to DNS, right? And they had co-authored the white paper with Akamai. Now, if you want 2 companies that know something about how DNS works on the internet, Google and Akamai are pretty good companies, right? Those are the people you want writing the DNS specification, right? And so part of the principle of the EEA is we want the specifications and the implementations thereof to be driven by the people who are closest to the code, right? Having a complex technical steering committee and top-down technical design is a terrible idea, right? And it's a terrible idea. You want the people that are working on closest to the protocol to be the people iterating the standards. So so Alex is going to talk a bit about this. But what we wanted to construct was an organization where there was formal governance at the top in the form of a board of directors and a technical steering committee, whose job it is to intervene when there's problems and stamp things when they're done. But the work of the EEA is designed to be done at the individual working group level, right? The second thing that's interesting is there's been a lot of interest above the protocol level at the application layer. So we have, I'm going to get this wrong, but we have the advertising working group, the legal working group, the token working group, the supply chain working group, the insurance working group, the healthcare working group, and the banking working group, right? All operating at the application level, as well as at the technical level, we have the standards working group, right? The people that are overall responsible for this, the ConsenSys working group, the privacy working group, and then what's going to become the access control working group, right? So the objective is that the work gets done on the working group, down at the working group level, and we iterate through to getting to the client. And you know, we do have the benefit that quite a lot of work has been done on this already, right? And Quorum in particular represents something pretty close to what enterprises are looking for. Admittedly, it is it's an MVP, not the end solution, but it's pretty close already to capturing what enterprises are looking for. So we have a benefit that we have some starting points, right? So the objective at a technical level is to iterate by the process of trying to solve the problems, right? If you want to implement a standardized interface for pluggable consensus in Ethereum, one of the things you need to do is start ripping apart the VM, right? And you need to pull the consensus, you need to pull the networking layer out of the VM implementation. You need to define an interface between the VM opcode interpreter and the networking layer, right? And then you need to define the interface between the peer-to-peer protocol and the consensus protocol, right? Because peer-to-peer is just shooting packets around, whereas consensus says, how do you come to agreement, right? And once you've done that, then you can really achieve pluggable consensus. I mean, there are ways of hacking it. And the thing is, the problem you have right now in Quorum is the implementation of Quorum is deeply tied into the Geth code base, right? There's a limited ability, for example, to take Constellation out of Quorum and run it on parity, right? Because it's a code-based modification. And so in order to get to something that allows you to do this with less code-based modification, you need to have these much more well-defined interfaces in between. So how do you do that? How do you do that as an organization? My opinion is the way you do that is you start doing it, right? You don't try and write the spec first, you try and write an implementation first, and as you write the implementation, you have to do all this rewiring, and then you're able to see where the interface bindings need to be between the different layers of the stack, right? So that's why, and Alex will talk about the working groups, that's why we've structured it so we have these sub-working groups, each working on a different problem, right? Because when they iterate through their problem, they're going to say, these are the interfaces you need to solve this, right? So we're at the point where we've sort of subdivided the problem into the three main categories plus the overall challenge of writing the standard, right, in order to get there. So you know, the key at this stage is going to be the companies involved that want this to happen need to do a lot of the legwork, right? The EEA does not have a mandate to hire developers, right? It has a mandate to have some staff, but it does not have a mandate to hire developers. The development of the standard needs to come from the members, right? This is one of the things that we think really distinguishes the EEA from other blockchain consortiums. We actually want it to be an open source project. We do not have the intent at ConsenSys of hiring 800 developers, building a code base, and then giving it to the Linux Foundation and telling everyone it's an open source project, right? There is another, not quite a blockchain that was built that way by another vendor, and that's just not the path that Ethereum is going down, right? So that means the success of NDEF is going to be in large determined by how many people work on the problems that are going on. Now the mission remains the same, to iterate through to a standard by the end of the year. Maybe that's Q1. That's not really a showstopper one way or the other. And in parallel, we do have real progress going on. So how many people saw the Amos announcement of PBFT into Quorum? Alex did because he was in the press release. So there is real progress going on right now on various code bases, right? So it's not like progress isn't happening, but for this to happen, we need a lot more member-driven effort formalized through the working groups to take place. So I guess what we can do at this stage, this is a logical point to transition to Alex for a working group update, but maybe if there's a couple of high-level questions on the EEA, I guess I can take them now first. Any questions at all? All right.